Welcome to the Joyful Nourishment Podcast. This is a podcast about our relationship with food and eating, body image, eating disorder recovery, mental health, and more. I am your host, Lynn Thorstensen, a registered nutrition therapist and body image coach based in the west of Ireland. And I'm so glad that you're here. Welcome back to another episode of the Joyful Nourishment Podcast. Today, I am speaking with Jonny Landels, who is a former diet culture obsessed fat loss coach turned intuitive eating coach and a health and exercise advocate. He spent years fighting his own body and believing that he just needed to be more disciplined and motivated to maintain weight loss long term. But a couple of years ago, he started learning more about disordered eating and intuitive eating, and then slowly pivoted his coaching business and retrained and has not looked back since. Jonny now helps clients break free from food and body obsession and end their constant mental battle with food, while using strength training to help them fall in love with exercise again. So, Jonny, thank you so much for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me, Lynn. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thank you. And to date, I have not had a guy on the Joyful Nourishment podcast. And I am acutely aware that in the eating disorder space and the disordered eating space and the health and exercise space and the non-diet space, it's very female dominated. Actually, it affects men too. So that's why I'm so glad to have you here today to talk about the work that you do and your own personal story. And I'm always interested as well when people have lived experience in this space to like how that shift happens, you know, from going from that weight obsession into weight inclusivity and health at every size, because it can be, I think sometimes you're either, I don't know, I'm curious to hear what it was like for you, but like sometimes it's like you get to the rock bottom and it's like, I don't know where to go from here. But then sometimes when people are not really that ready and they get introduced to non-diet and health at every size, it feels too confronting. And it's like, I'm not so sure, and this feels a bit too radical. And so I'm always curious about what does that sort of arc look like in that transition too. But yeah, please feel free to add more to your introduction as well.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good point, because I think it is a radical shift, and it can be quite difficult to adopt, and it was difficult to adopt. And it's why that if you were to look back at content of mine and podcasts of mine, even to probably not a year ago, but maybe to just over a year ago, there would have still been me speaking a fair bit about fat loss, but I would have been talking about using mindful eating to kind of help, and like listening to your body. And I'd started to use language like rejecting diet culture and diet mentality in terms of only focusing on manipulating your body and focusing more on behaviors and actions that aligned with sort of who you are, and then letting what happened to your body be a byproduct of that. But because of where I'd come from, both personally and professionally, there was still me kind of focusing that within like fat loss as the kind of main goal, as if that's like, well, that's what everybody wants to achieve or needs to achieve as per my previous education. So to give you a kind of brief intro, like on top of that bio. So when I was a teenager, I was a little bit bigger, and I was bullied a little bit for being fat. And I had parents who were bigger as well. My mum was sort of always on or off a diet. And as the family, we kind of just did that with her. And my dad was a bigger bloke as well, and they ran a business together. So, you know, they were very busy. They smoked a lot. Didn't eat particularly well outside of the kind of on and off dieting, if that makes sense. It was very chaotic, very all or nothing. And were quite inactive people because of the pressure they put themselves under to run a business themselves and bring up two kids. My father unfortunately passed away when I was in my teens, and when you look back at that with a very inspective eye, you could see that one, he had a family history of heart disease. Two, he was a very, very heavy smoker. Three, he wasn't particularly active outside of work and was very stressed. And the kind of last nail was that leading up to that, he'd actually had a thyroid condition, an overactive thyroid, and that had put a lot of pressure on his heart as well. But society being society and me being 16, I kind of just thought, well, my dad was bigger, my dad was fat, therefore this is a kind of byproduct of that weight as opposed to the whole piece of the puzzle. And I threw myself into men's health magazines and kind of standard fitness culture magazines and media as you do. And that sort of started off my journey of like, I wanted to be in as best shape as I could possibly be. And that was definitely fueled from that teenage angst, bullying, negative body image piece as well. And it's so interesting because I look back at myself between the ages of sort of 16 to 18, and I was, relatively straight sized guy. I still am, right? I still wear large to extra large clothing off the rack. I don't struggle with being in a bigger body really. Maybe slightly bigger than normal, as if we were to use the BMI categories, right? But it was never something that I should have been worrying about. I just was slightly bigger boned and played rugby. So being called fat was just an easy dig, I think, for school friends of mine because I was just bigger than they were. So I really wish I could go back and give my kind of younger self a slap. But what happened from there was because I started going to the gym quite heavily with my friends, and then I found CrossFit. CrossFit kind of took over for me after my rugby days. And CrossFit became something that I was just instantly obsessed with. I loved competing. I loved being athletic. I loved rugby, and CrossFit was like lifting weights, but in a much more enjoyable way. And I quickly found myself getting certified as a CrossFit coach while I was doing my master's degree. And it meant that when I moved to London in my early 20s, after my master's degree, I got a job as a CrossFit coach to live in London. And that was my start in the fitness industry, was being a CrossFit coach. Now in my 20s, I'd kind of had been going through a weight cycling phase already, unbeknownst to me. So I would either do the paleo diet and feel like I lost weight and get a bit leaner, and then I would stop doing the paleo diet and the weight would come back on. Or when I was in Wales on my master's degree, I started working at a bodybuilding shop for some money, and the owner of the bodybuilding store gave me a meal plan, for example, like a 7 day a week meal plan. And I would find that when I followed the meal plan, I would lose weight and get leaner. And then when I wasn't following the meal plan, obviously I wasn't. And this had kind of kept happening. And as I was a CrossFit coach, and I still felt like I was carrying extra body fat. And again, I look back and I'm like, what were you even thinking about? But our head does stupid things, which, as we all know, can be that kind of disordered eating / eating disorder voice. But I decided to sign up for a nutrition coach in back end of 2014. So it was like December 2014, I started with him. And so that was when I was 24. And it was effectively track all of your calories, try to hit protein, carbohydrates, and fats to a certain degree of accuracy. So it was tracking each individual macro as well. And now this
God, that
was on
sounds
top
like a lot
of,
of work.
it was a lot of work, but I was in my mid 20s. I was in a long distance relationship. So effectively, I was living single through the week. And I was working as a full-time CrossFit coach. And so my days were incredibly active as well, right? I would get up, I would walk to the tube station, I'd take the tube to Canary Wharf, I would walk from the tube station to where the gym was, I'd do my first training session, I'd then do a bit of work, I'd do a second training session, and then I would coach the evening classes, which would be all on my feet, and then I would do that same route home. So I was incredibly active, training twice a day, started tracking all of my macros, and I got ridiculously lean, the leanest I've ever been. And then that's when I decided to become a nutrition coach, because I was like, right, I can help people have this same sort of epic transformation that I've had. That was my reasoning behind it, especially within the CrossFit gym. I thought, all of the members want these kind of results, so I'll offer nutrition coaching as a bolt onto our classes. And that was the start of my nutrition company. Now, what followed from that, besides, a house move and job changes and all the rest of the things that happen as you get older and move from your mid-20s to early 30s, my weight was just cycling up and down, up and down, up and down. And it didn't matter how many nutrition certifications that I got, which is quite a few now, and how much I knew. It was that I always needed to be tracking my calories or fasting or doing something relatively extreme in order to get any form of level of leanness that I felt was acceptable. But the issue with that 2015 journey was how lean I'd gotten. I never ever got that lean ever again. Never ever got there ever again. And the reason that I'd stopped tracking and stopped working with that coach was because I could see the negative effects it was happening on me, both mentally and physically. So
Okay.
I'd started with him in 2014, the November, December 2014. By July 2015, it was actually on my birthday, funnily enough. So it was July 2015. I had a 2-day competition, CrossFit competition, over the course of my birthday. And throughout that weekend, I was just incredibly tired. I was so tired. And I was like, why am I so tired? I've been focusing on my nutrition for this whole time. I've been training really hard. And I remember I had friends down, friends from home down because it was my birthday. And they'd kind of hung out with another one of my friends that day rather than coming to the competition, which I didn't blame them for because it was like an hour out of London, real logistical nightmare for 25-year-old lads to try and do. Um, but I didn't perform very well in that competition, and I was really, really angry with myself about it. And I had um, a really, really bad binge, basically, really, really quite terrifying binge, um, because I just thought, screw it, what's the point? Um, and I remember because it was a meal out with my friends for my birthday, and I just had loads of food. I had dessert. We then went home, and I had even more like chocolate and sweets and things like that, like literally like really, really heavy binge. And I'd had experiences of sort of like cheat day mentalities up to this point, right? Like using Sunday as like a cheat day before you're then good again all week. So I'd had
Yeah.
many things of this, but never so much in one time. And that wasn't then the only time that had happened. Then, as I kind of continued trying to track my calories, but not working with this coach, I would then have a birthday party, for example, for someone else, and there'd be loads of food, and I would just binge because I'd be like, well, I'm not tracking calories, so I'm just gonna go off the deep end
Yeah.
here. So that had been quite worrying for me, which is why, although I tried to move away from tracking, I kept finding myself either being pulled back to tracking or fasting or something like that because I kept wanting to get leaner again. Every time I stopped doing that and put some fat back on, I'd be like, oh, I'm not lean anymore. I need to, I'm supposed to be a nutrition coach. I'm supposed to be in shape. I'm supposed to have this sorted.
So it was going back and forwards then, and like both sort of how your body was responding, but also like how you were eating. It's like if I'm not tracking, I'm not in control. And then if I sort of break the control, I might as well let it all happen because
Yeah.
sure.
And even there was, but it was either not tracking or it was like there were some times when I would try apply control, but it would be like through fasting, or it would be through doing, okay, well, for 2 meals of the day, I'll only have protein and vegetables, and then I'll have a mixed meal as my sort of third meal of the day, and I'll keep my snacks to a minimum. Or it was something like, okay, I'll have mixed meals, but I'll use, like hand portion sizes to be like, I'll only have like one portion of carbs with like 2 portions of protein and like one portion. So I was always trying to hyper control it rather than kind of digging into what my body was telling me. And now, years later, and with the experience of intuitive eating and everything, I can see that I was very much setting myself up for failure by always hyper controlling. But at the time, it was that kind of chaotic need for control, like need for some form of aesthetic response, being scared each time I lost that response, thinking it was my fault. And as I said, it wasn't until 2020 where a couple of things happened in 2020, which were outside of the pandemic. One was I watched a really interesting documentary that was on the BBC that was actually with the famous cricket person, Andrew Flintoff. And it was like an Andrew Flintoff bulimia episode. And he was talking with these therapists about how he'd always been bullied for his weight by media and all the rest of it. And he'd now reached a point where he was training several times a day and was worried not to train and needed to do those things. And the woman was like, "This is bulimia." And he was like, "Oh, right. I thought it was only that if you actually, actively purged in some way."
Yeah.
And when I was watching that episode, I was just thinking like, oh my God, that is exactly how I was when I was in my competitive CrossFit space. Like I was training twice a day for competitive reasons because of the amount of things you've got to get good at in CrossFit. But there was also if I don't do this, I'm gonna not be as lean as I need to be. I'm gonna put on weight if I miss a training session.
Yeah.
My now wife and I have been together since 2018, and we went on holiday together in 2018. And although I was preparing for a CrossFit competition in that holiday, there was also oh, well, I need to get to the gym this, each morning of the holiday because I need to be getting it done. And she was a bit like, oh God, like, who is this guy type thing. I remember we've had a chat about it now, and she was like, it's pretty interesting because I was on the way out of competitive CrossFit in 2018, 2019. And she was like, you did used to be so anxious around exercise.
Mm.
And she's noticed the big change around food as well, holidays and Christmas times and things like that. She's like, you're so much more. It's weird that turning into an intuitive eater fully can actually just make you much more normal around food and reserved around food. And so and you don't want to use the word control because that can be such a trigger word for people, but it's so funny where when you're trying to anxiously control your food, you're actually more chaotic than ever. Whereas when
Yeah.
you embrace intuitive eating, you then actually become much more reserved around all of these foods that used to cause you such ridiculous anxiety and self-hatred. Um,
Yeah. It's
so
such a
that
dichotomy, right? And it's hard when you're in that controlling, anxious space to really trust that process, that if you let that go, actually what you're doing is really open up space for choice. Now
yes,
you're in control rather than this external kind of thing that's trying to control you.
exactly.
It's weird, and I mean, I see it all the time. I'm sure you do as well with the people you work with. It's like once you feel it or you get it, it's like it's almost like magic. But to make the leap from there can be really hard, particularly if there is that fear of like, how is my body going to change and I'm going to gain weight and what am I going to do with that? And I don't want that to happen. And there's all of that work also, I think, that needs to happen. But what what strikes me listening to your story is almost like how similar it is to a lot of the stories that give my own lived experience, but also like people I work with, which is mostly females. And it's just like, oh, it is not that much different. And here's a guy. But what you said as well, to see that same story being told by another guy and realize, oh, actually, maybe what I'm doing here is it's not so healthy or
Yeah.
helpful.
And I think that's the thing, Lynn, because I saw that documentary and they spoke about bulimia and things like that, and I was like, wow, I never knew of that kind of diagnostic criteria. I'd never been assessed, and it's interesting because then I started to discover about disordered eating through a coaching certification I was doing, and it wasn't the intuitive eating one; it was a different one that was all about helping people with behavior change. So it was focused more on counseling skills like motivational interviewing and cognitive behavioral therapy. But it talked about disordered eating in terms of the kind of screening for clients, as well as when you notice working with clients, if you're trying to improve someone's health and fitness, it's like this can be the sort of darker side when things go too far. And when I was looking at a lot of those mindsets and behaviors, anxiety and control all or nothing, and moments of food chaos followed by ultimate control, and yeah, just compensation, bargaining, all of those things. It was just a wake-up call to see the life that I had been living. So I'd never formally been diagnosed with an eating disorder, but I think if I had ever gone to a eating disorder therapist or dietitian, they probably would have given me, EDNOS, because it probably didn't classify as one of the specific ones. And I think that's where a lot of people fall through the cracks. It's like, if they don't meet the very specific criteria, they're just thinking, well, what do I do now? And I think as well, eating disorder can come with such high levels of stigma.
Yeah.
And I never want to associate, it's not that I don't want to associate with that. It's that I don't want to take away from somebody who potentially struggled more than I did and got a specific diagnosis. But when I look back, I'm like, there were definitely some very heavy disordered eating practices. And the stigma around these things definitely needs to be dropped, because a lot of the fitness industry will see people working in those ways and be like, wow, like look at how disciplined you are, look at how motivated you are, look at how hard you're working. And I definitely played off of that from someone who'd always been bullied as being fat when they were a teenager. I was like, well, look at me now. I've got this epic transformation and this complete lifestyle change. And it just makes me realize now, as a 33-year-old first time dad who works from home and now leads a very different lifestyle, is like, so much of what you see in the fitness industry on social media is dictated by people's genetics and also the lifestyles they have when they are living in a gym. It's a very, very different lifestyle to, I work from home. So imagine doing a 40 to 50 hour a week and having a commute and having kids and all the rest of it on top. It's just, we're shamed by such a ridiculous sort of small percentile of society, and it's just not feasible.
No. And I think as well, like you said something there, it's like sometimes like the amount of work and hours you have to put in to look that lean, it becomes your whole life. And is that healthy, or is that kind of, I mean, if that's what you want to do for a period of time, there's nothing wrong with that. But it's like nobody can sustain that forever,
No,
unless it becomes
unless
you're
it is
trying
your
to maintain
lifestyle.
it. Yeah,
Unless you
and
become a full-time
questionable.
coach and then just to do that as your lifestyle.
But then if it comes with that challenge, like what you experienced, like the continuous anxiety then around food and body, it's like, is the cost too high of trying to maintain that kind of lifestyle?
100%. And I think that's this is where the biggest hypocrisy of the fitness industry comes in, is this idea of, well, just do that work once and then we can get you to a maintenance place. And it's where the great podcast Maintenance Phase gets their name from, right? Is this lie of this maintenance phase that exists beyond this horrific diet phase. And I'm telling you now, like, that it just does not exist. That phase doesn't exist. You have the body that your body will be at when you are living the life that is most in accordance with your values. Yeah, okay, there might be some behaviors and things that we can work on. Like, as you said, when we're working with people with eating disorders or disordered eating, we can help you get to a place where you feel like you're eating in accordance with your body's cues. You're making food incredibly nourishing. You're not binging anymore. You're exercising again in a way that feels good for you, whatever that looks like. And you're doing all of that in a great way. Your body then is going to sit where your body wants to sit. And that is determined by things outside of your control. And it's like, I did all of these heavily disordered actions for so long. And as I said, because it took me a while to learn about health at every size properly and fully embrace it, because everything I'd learned nutrition wise from 2015 to 2021 had been all very weight centric, healthcare based, classic sort of nutrition and fitness advice. Even through the pandemic, on the post side of the pandemic, I was still walking twice a day, and I was going for like an extra bike ride or an extra row to do some extra conditioning, and I was still exercising for about an hour and a half of like weightlifting, like really heavy weightlifting. And when I put that aside, and in the last couple of years, I've had a sort of brief recovery with exercise piece, but I've still exercised 3 to 4 times a week. I walk my dogs twice a day for sort of 30 to 45 minutes because they need the work as well, and it feels nice to just go for a walk. So it's not for like extra steps. But I exercise a few times a week. I eat entirely inside of my appetite, and I walk my dogs twice a day. And it's like I've steadily put on weight in the last couple of years. And it's like, so it's not like I did all of that work, quote unquote, and then I could maintain that body with less work. It was like that body was only maintainable because of the extreme workload that was taking for me to maintain it. So
Yeah.
it's not a maintainable body shape for me.
Yeah. 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 And I think it's, and you know, and we hear about atypical anorexia as well, which is basically people with restrictive eating disorders in bigger bodies. So this whole myth of calories in, calories out actually doesn't really work in reality. And maybe, like you said, it might work really well the first time, but that might be that. Or it might work for some people, but it doesn't work for other people.
No.
And because our bodies aren't, they're not as simple as that. Like, and
No.
yeah, that's a whole, but it's really hard, I think, to get that, like, to understand that, yes, somebody can sit in front of you and they can tell you, this is what I'm eating. And you're like, it's very little. And why are they not losing weight with that? Because their body's like, it's not, I'm not letting go of anything because there's no food going around here. So, and we all have our own individual set points, and things also change as you age or as your life circumstances change and whatever. So, but it's because we're continuously fed this narrative through the fitness industry, through the medical system, that if you just do this, quote unquote, eat less, move more, we'll all be thin. But that's not true. And also, that doesn't mean that we'd all be healthy, because it's not that simple either.
No. It's that big piece, as you mentioned, that our bodies are not simple maths equations, right? And we don't exist within closed systems. We've got a lot of things that happen around us, and there's a lot of dynamics within somebody's energy metabolism, and a lot of those things are outside of our control, and they affect people to different degrees um of adjustment. So, because I mentioned sort of like thyroid hormone being something that my dad had issues with, but so those things within people work in different manners, right? We've got different levels of those. We've got, when people try to eat less, their hunger hormone ghrelin might increase, their satiety hormone leptin might go down, their movement might decrease despite them trying to do more steps or do more exercise, right? So their exercise outside of these things goes down, as well as the energy they expend doing those things goes down as the body tries to withhold more energy, and the energy you then absorb from food goes up, right? So everything works against you, and that affects people in different ways, as you said, with their set points. And that's why when you look at research within the weight loss space, you'll see such grand differences between people's results. And the kind of non-speculative eye would be like, well, that would just be down to how well people stuck with the approach, rather than taking a keener eye and going, well, what's happening on an individual level here that's affecting these results?
Yeah.
And you see that with the twin studies, when twins get completely different results off of the same intervention, even within that kind of small population of gene pool, you've got such varied differences.
That's so interesting. I actually wasn't aware of that. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
And so it's keeping those things in mind, that everybody is incredibly different with those complex systems, and that narrative that, hey, we can all get to this normal BMI body weight is just completely farcical. Just takes away all of the body diversity that exists within the population, and just thinks, well, we should all just look like this. And it's like, well, where are you getting that from?
I know. And it also feels like if if the only reason we're exercising, and whether that be in a gym or walking or whatever, is to lose weight or to manipulate our bodies, it feels like all the other potential benefits that comes with moving your body and working on flexibility and cardiovascular improvements, and strength and things, it's just gone out the window. It's like that doesn't matter if it doesn't make you thin or it doesn't changes, your body leaning up or what the number in the scale shows. So, can you speak to that? Like what, so how you work now in terms of helping people like fall in love with fitness and exercise again? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, it's a good question because I think, as you said there, Lynn, like there's so many benefits to physical training that are outside of that manipulation of the physical space of physical body. And annoyingly, when you get into magazines like Men's Health and Men's Fitness and Women's Health, Women's Fitness, and all the rest of it, and magazines like Slimming World and stuff, it's all about that physical transformation. They dropped X pounds and gain X pounds of muscle and look this way, and it's all you've got the cover models on the front, and it's all very physique driven. Whereas, as you said, there's benefits to exercise in terms of strength, mobility, function, heart health, glucose management,
Mental
cardiovascular
health.
fitness, mental health, all of those
Yeah.
things, and I know for me, yeah, mentally, when I'm walking outside and going to the gym regularly, my mental health is a lot better. But I do all those things because I want to keep myself healthy as much as I can within my control, right? There are a lot of social determinants of health that are outside of our control, and there's family histories of things and all that. But the research shows that despite your BMI, if you eat fruits and vegetables, you don't smoke, you sleep well, and you exercise regularly, you've got the same risk of all-cause mortality as people in lower BMIs. And for me, that's important to me in terms of my longevity and my function, right? I want to be able to move well. I want to be able to move well as I age. I want to kind of offset sarcopenia and osteoporosis as much as I can by resistance training. And I want to be there for my kids, right? I want to be able to play with them. I want to be able to run with them. I want to be able to lift them up. I want to be able to carry them. And I want to be able to do those things for long periods of time. And that requires a certain work capacity. And no matter your size, you can improve your strength and your fitness, but it takes actively doing those things.
Yeah. 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 And how do you, like, if say now, even within from your own experience, coming from a sort of a disordered eating, challenging relationship with movement or exercise, how do you kind of make sure that it can stay in a way that feels positive and nourishing and supportive for your overall life? And like, how do you notice, oh right, maybe I need to pull back a bit because I'm about to get sucked into, it's becoming a bit too much, or I'm feeling myself pulled back into that disordered space again?
Yeah, great question, because I think, as I mentioned, over the last year or two, there's been certain life things going on as well, but my consistency has been lower in terms of weekly sessions because I was not enjoying it as much. And I had to take the time to consider what I was exercising for, but also what I really enjoyed. And I could tell I was getting into a bad place again because I was getting pulled into the idea of doing more cardio and more conditioning work. And I'd started getting thoughts of like, hey, you run your own business. If you want to get up and go for a run with the dogs rather than walk the dogs, you can. So you can run and it would take the same time. And that could be your first session. And then you could walk to the gym in the afternoon and do your second session. And then all you need to do is catch up with work later on in the evening. And I could hear myself talking to me about this. And I'd had some physique changes through this last year in particular again. So I was like, I was starting to have those thoughts again. And I think that was because it's very difficult when you're in a CrossFit gym, because I still train in a CrossFit gym now. And I've got friends who are competitive in the space and stuff still. So when you see their lifestyles and you watch all that, it can be very easy to get sucked back in.
Yeah.
And I think so it's just noticing that it's very normal to have those thoughts, particularly in the society that we live in. And then, as you said, there's a moment between that kind of thought and action where you can choose to respond, right? That pause point. So it's just noticing that pause point and thinking to yourself, right, is this me speaking in terms of my values and what's important to me, or is this a negative kind of diet induced thought? And I was able to say, look, those thoughts aren't serving me. And because I've worked on my interoception, so that listening to my body voice, I can tell when I'm tired, and I can tell when I'm training enough for where my capacity is now. So what day on Friday? I exercised Monday and Tuesday, and then Wednesday I just walked the dogs, and then yesterday life was just crazy busy. A lot of things happened that were outside of my control, and I had all intention of going to the gym, but as well, I'd woken up pretty tired again. So then by the end of the day, I was like, well, I can either fit in a session now, or I can make a nourishing dinner and spend time with my family. And I'm like, I'm going to do that.
Yeah.
So
And I
it's
think
just,
that's the difference, right? In when you're not compulsively led by it anymore. You have
yeah,
the capacity to make the choice that, because there'd be another day you can go to the gym, or another day, like it's going to be more opportunities to move your body. Whereas when if you're still stuck in the compulsivity of it, it might be higher, like more likely that you would have gone to the gym rather than being at home having a nourishing dinner with your family, because that would
yeah,
be more had higher priority or more pull.
yeah, exactly. And as you said there, the compulsivity is a key thing to look for. And then your intention behind a decision is always the more important piece. So if someone was saying to me, like, I really want to work out and exercise more, but I'm struggling for time, then we're having a different conversation, right? We're talking about how can we do less and do it throughout the day, and or do a smaller session at some point, and be okay with that being enough. Because I know from my background of having been a twice a day bloke, you know, if you're then saying, oh, I'll just do 15 minutes of kettlebell swings and push-ups, you're like, well, what's that? It's nothing. I used to train, 2 hours a day. And you're like, yeah, but that 15 minutes is better than none.
Yeah.
And so it's,
Yeah.
you have to change that conversation depending on who's in front of you.
And that's also so important, I think, because we forget about, like, even that the small things add up over time, whereas it's so easy to get stuck in that all or nothing mentality, whether that's like with food and eating, but also with movement and exercise. It's like, well, if I can't do 2 hours, like, what's the point? No point
Yeah.
bothering, what you're saying. Actually, the 15 minutes of exercise can be just as beneficial.
Yeah. I think you were asking about, well, what's this unique experience potentially when it comes to somebody who's like a cis male. And that would be it. When I chat to my clients who are male and they've come from CrossFit or they've come from spaces like that, and they've then had those periods of intensity where they've been training a lot, like twice a day or following a competitive program. If they then burn out of CrossFit, which many people do, because of the intensity of a competitive program, they might then move into something like endurance running or triathlon or hybrid athlete type things. And then their role models are people like David Goggins and Ross Edgley, who are people who do really dramatic, massive kind of challenges, and also who live lifestyles that pertain to those things, and also mindsets. David Goggins' mindset stuff is pretty damaging stuff, really, when you listen to his monologues and things. It's like, yeah, I'm not really sure this is coming from a healthy place. And but if you're someone who's kind of wrapped up in that language and that mentality, it's so difficult to move away from it. To be like, I need
Yeah.
to prove myself. I work with guys who are bigger, who are like, yeah, I've done an ultra, and it was because I wanted to prove that someone at my size could do an ultra. And you're like, well, but who are you proving this to? You don't need to prove yourself to anyone. And then
Mm.
it's kind of cycling that back to like, what are your values as a person? What does healthy exercise look like and mean to you? Like, how do you want it to feel? And what do you actually enjoy? And how can we cultivate that? Because if you put a big challenge or a big external thing as your goal, once you've done that, there's nothing left. You've done it. You're then
Yeah.
scrambling for kind of any level of consistency again, because you put everything on it's just like tracking your food. You put it all on an external metric rather than finding the answer internally.
Yeah. And it's just that, and I think it's, well, like what you said, in doing those challenges, is it, I want to prove to the world that somebody like me can do this, or I want to prove to myself that I was able to do something like that. And it just feels like the shift in energy is because it's like you put it out, but even if you're doing it just for yourself to prove to yourself, it's like you can still be left with a kind of an empty space, kind of going, okay, well now what? Like I did that probably 10 years ago. I cycled 100K kind of, charity, one of those races, and which was something I think I'd never thought I would be able to do. And it felt really great in the ways that my body was able for something that my mind wasn't really sure that it was actually capable of. But afterwards, I didn't really cycle much more on my racing bike after that. It sat
No.
nearly 10 years in the garage until I got rid of it last year and traded in for a normal kind of everyday lady's bike. So it was, even though it felt like such a nice achievement and it gave me kind of a confidence boost, but it still kind of left a hole in consistency, because I suppose there was a certain intensity and a culmination, and then it's like, right, now what? I didn't have a strong enough desire to prove that I could do it again, because I
Yeah.
had just done it.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. I think it's a great point. I think there's something to be said for raising money for charity, and then something to be said for, let's say, doing a physical challenge, and as you said, reaping the kind of mental rewards of doing that because you weren't sure that you could do it. And then also you're doing something quite dramatic, and that's fundraising, because people are like, oh well, go you, I really hope that you can do it, and here's some money toward that. And it's interesting that that's become the human condition, right? Rather than like, hey, I'm raising money for this really great charity and it means a lot to me, like, do you mind donating, because you want to donate to that charity, rather than like, watch me physically flog myself for you to pony up the money to donate to the charity. It's like, it's quite, but
Yeah.
obviously it is now, that's the thing, isn't it? It started with marathons and it's kind of evolved from there. And similarly, like I grow a mustache every November to raise awareness for Movember and men's mental health and physical health and things. And the last 2 years, 2021 and 2022, I'd done physical challenges sort of throughout the month, and it had been more inspired because a friend of mine had done something quite similar. So I was like, well, I'm going to challenge myself. And in 2021, I did a 10K run every day of November. And then in 2022, I didn't really know what to do, so I did an 11K run every day in November. Sorry, that was in 2022. And through that, I raised a lot of money. But then in 2023, we were in the middle of a house renovation that was really dragging, and we had a quite strict deadline on it. So we were having to do quite a lot of work ourselves. We just had our baby in October, and I'd sort of set myself a mini thing of like, right, I'm going to do a workout every day. CrossFit have these things called hero workouts. So I was like, right, I'll do a hero workout every day in November. And some of them in that first week had to be bodyweight workouts that I did around the house. But then I had to kind of stop myself and think, one, I was getting absolutely battered. I was like, my body is not recovering the way that it probably could have done when I was younger, and exercising more. Two, I've got a baby, so I'm not sleeping very well. And three, it's like we've got this house renovation, so it's like, why am I giving up another hour of my day to go and do this when I'm shoveling gravel or painting walls or doing things that are actually really, really important for my family right now?
Yeah.
And something within me as well was like, am I doing this for the charity, or am I doing it to prove that I can still do it, that I've still got it? And I wasn't really sure. I think it was probably a bit of both. Like, the charity is really, really close to my heart. And a friend of mine still does these ridiculous, I mean, he's insane with what he does. but he does these ridiculous physical challenges to raise money for it. And part of me was like, cool, I want to raise money in that way as well. It means a lot to me too, but a part of it was also, are you proving something to people? And from a time perspective, I was like, this just isn't working for me. I'm gonna have to call it quits. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And did you feel okay with that then in the end, like to actually let it go?
I did, because it was the right thing that I needed to do for the house and for the family, and also like for me physically. I don't think I would have been able to continue doing it. I did feel a bit of guilt to be like, I told people I was doing it and I was trying to raise money, and I felt a bit bad because I was like, I raise money for it every year, but I think it was okay to hold both of those feelings at the same time.
I think so. And I think thank you for sharing that, because I think we don't talk about that enough, that we can do the right thing and we can feel that loss or guilt or sadness, or even maybe it could be tinged with shame, but it was still the right decision. And that's okay too. It's like,
Yeah.
it's not failure to say, actually, yeah, I need to call it off, or I need to pivot, or it's just natural, I think, to be able to do that, and to be able to, I think that's a sign of growth when we can step back and say, actually, I realize this isn't for me right now.
Yeah.
And even if
Yeah.
it's hard to do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, definitely.
Because I think when we're younger, you're in your 20s or even in your early 30s, it's like, I can just plow through and muscle through and, push through. And then it's like, I'm a bit older than you, and I'm like, I think I'm done with that. But it's just, the drive is important, but I think it's also important to kind of know when it's time to maybe stop or take a pause or check in, like you said. Why am I doing this again? Like, what is my intention behind it? Is it coming from that like nourishing place, or is it coming from a punishing place, or I have to prove myself, or to
Yeah.
myself or to other people? And what does that mean? And to be sort of reflective. So yeah, I had another question that I really wanted to talk about. And like, just to sort of pivot the conversation a bit before we sort of bringing to a close, because you mentioned the benefits for you personally when you saw another man talking about his experience with food and exercise and his body. And what are like, if somebody's listening to this conversation today and they either have a male in their life that they're kind of like worried about, or thinking maybe, like you were saying, your now wife was like, was he anxious about food and he has to go to the gym every day? Like what's that about? And, whether that's a young person or it's somebody even older in your, maybe in their 20s or 30s or even 40s or 50s, like if you as a partner or as a friend or as a parent, particularly now for a male, like what would you, this is where am I going with this question? Like what would be helpful, do you think, for somebody to hear, to, like, if it was a guy listening to this conversation, what would you want to say to them to be able to check in with their own relationship around food and their body and
Yeah,
exercise?
it's a good question. I think because we mentioned earlier about the intention behind the decision being more important than the decision itself. I think if you're in a position where your intentions behind your decisions are only because of trying to manipulate your body as much as you can, getting as lean as you can or as muscly as you can, and you're noticing that that's creating anxiety within you, right? Because you have to track your food, or you have to cook your own food, or you can't go out to eat because you don't have the calories left, or you haven't budgeted for the calories that day, or you have a binge because you've been restricting food all week, or you do have a binge and then you're like, man, I need to get up early tomorrow and do extra conditioning, extra workouts. If you're having these thoughts, this anxiety, this control, this compensation, this bargaining, this restriction followed by chaos, it's like you've got to realize that's not a lack of discipline. It's not a lack of willpower. It's not that you're broken. It's like this is actually very, very common side effects of a very unhealthy and disordered relationship with food and exercise, and you are not alone in that. And so if it's yourself listening to this and you're like, man, I really resonate with what's going on here, it's like, give me a follow, give me a message, see that these things affect other men as well, and see that it's totally normal. Get out of the David Goggins stay hard mentality and the ridiculous things that we hear from these kind of motivational gurus of wanting it more and trying harder and being your best. It's like when you're having those really, really negative connotations, it's because something is drastically going on, and your body and mind are kind of actively fighting against this. And you can live an active and healthy lifestyle without putting yourself through that misery and pushing yourself to that brink.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, because I think it's like knowing that what you said there, it's not your lack of discipline, it's actually a side effect of this kind of restrictive, punitive relationship with food and exercise. So knowing it's like, because I feel like that's the conversation that for those of us with lived experience who are in this space needs to keep talking about, because it's almost like when you're in it yourself, you think it's a me problem and I'm the one that is not functioning right, until you start hearing that, no, it's not a you problem. These are side effects of restrictive eating or over-exercising or trying to manipulate our bodies. And there is a large cultural kind of aspect to this. It's like, it's actually your body's probably working quite well, that it's resisting against these things because that's not conducive to survival. But I think the more of that conversation, I feel like that's out there, the more people can have that experience like you did, seeing somebody talking about their relationship with food and going, oh, actually, that's me.
Yeah.
Okay, well, what does that mean now? And can I change it? So the flip side of that, Jonny, then what is what's a healthy relationship with exercise and movement?
Oh, good question. I think a healthy relationship with food and movement is just a position where it's going to look different for different people based on their lifestyle, obviously, and where they're at with it. But I think a healthy place where you're showing maybe dedication to a fitness goal without it overtaking your life is being okay. You're organized with your training and with your food, but not to a position where it's that or nothing. It's not like you're going to sacrifice time with your family or sacrifice time with your friends to go to the gym. You're not going to feel anxious when you go to a friend's house for a dinner or have somebody else cook food for you or go out for a meal. You don't have to sit there and track all of your food into your phone, and actually your food decisions are dictated by your body, right? That combination of intuition, emotion, and rational thought. What do I need today? Like, what am I fancying? What kind of food makes me feel good? What do I enjoy eating? And you're able to have that spontaneity in your life without it sending you into a complete spiral. And you're active again, it's in a way that it enhances your life. This is the kind of dichotomy I think of CrossFit, because as I said, I don't dislike it, but I don't do it anymore, and I don't train that way because really the level of intensity of sessions would just leave you feeling burnt out and tired. And it's like your movement practice wants to leave you invigorated. Ideally, you want to be leaving the gym with more energy and in a better mood, not absolutely shafted and struggling to finish your work for the day.
Yeah, that's a good point, I think. So one of the questions that I asked all my guests as we close is what is joyful nourishment to you?
Great question. For me, joyful nourishment is finding the satisfaction in food. The satisfaction in exercise again was very helpful for me to find, what exercise do I genuinely enjoy, and for me that is weightlifting, but for other people it's different things. And this year I want to get out to do more hiking and more potentially, go for a water sports day or go rock climbing or things, because I grew up in the Lake District and so I did that a fair bit growing up. And then from a food perspective, what I found incredibly helpful is getting recipe box deliveries where I'm excited about the meals that we're going to be making for our evening meal. And there's a really great variety of proteins and starches and veg. So rather than kind of cooking the same few meals I know how to cook well, and always eating chicken breast and like fry light spray, I'm using actual olive oil, and I'm cooking, let's say like chicken thighs, or I think we've got some form of fish in this week's box, and or just cooking a fully vegetarian meal, but it's got pulses and grains and beans and 3 different types of leaf, and a dressing that tastes really great, right? Like a honey and balsamic olive oil based dressing, rather than a fat-free Caesar dressing that just tastes of nothing.
I know.
It's finding ways to make food enjoyable, rather than
Yeah.
like, oh well, how can I eat healthy? Okay, I'll have this low calorie spray and I'll eat chicken breast and broccoli, and it's like,
Yeah,
no.
I always wonder what is it with like chicken breast and broccoli thing, like for the fitness stuff. And I remember like about 10 years ago in the early days of Instagram, you'd follow these fitness accounts and you'd see, it was like chicken breast, broccoli, and sweet potatoes. That was
Yeah,
kind of it.
yeah, that was the meal prep life. So if I could tell you now the exact meal plan that I had when I got that bodybuilder meal plan from that store owner, because I followed it when I was 22 all the way up until I was 24, pretty much. That's why I started flexible dieting, because I was
Right.
constantly either on this meal plan or I wasn't on it, and I was just sick to death of it.
Yeah.
And that was like eggs and egg whites in the morning with spinach. It was Greek yogurt and protein shake with some rice cakes. Mid-morning, it was 2 meals of chicken breast and sweet potato and broccoli in the middle of the day. And then it was a meal of like beef and green veg only in the evening, and then like cottage cheese in the evening as well. It was horrifically boring and sad.
I mean, yeah. Yeah. Like all of those foods on their own in different ways can be really tasty and lovely, but like, I don't know. Yeah, my taste buds would be crying, I think, of
Oh yeah.
boredom for the same kind of things. And it's just, I also wonder though, like over time, for that length of time, like there is a higher risk, I would imagine, of develop some nutrition deficiencies as well, because it's
100%.
so limited, in that sense. So again, how we define health and what we think about as healthy and how we think about self-care and nourishment, I think we could be here for another few hours, maybe try to
Yeah.
dissect that kind of conversation. But it is, I suppose, really starting to think about that in a much wider sense. Um, and what I'm taking from our conversation is really returning back to the sense that there is lots of benefits from exercise and movement and moving our bodies and doing that in a way that feels good. And like ideally, like you said, we should leave feeling more vigorated than burnt out afterwards, and removing the focus on trying to change our bodies by doing exercise can actually then widen the space to bring in all the joys that can come from that too.
Yeah.
So yeah. So thanks so much, Jonny. And do you work mostly with men or with women also, or kind of?
I do work with both. I do find men obviously sometimes struggle to talk about these kind of things and gravitate outwards, but I do work with both. And I've got a one-to-one service which is more counseling led in terms of conversations through video call. But then I've also got a group community that I'm growing, which is quite heavily sort of directed towards men, which
That's
is a
great.
combination of on-demand materials, audios, worksheets, as well as then we do a group coaching call each week. That group coaching call is a great space to be able to ask questions or even just sit back and listen to the conversations around you, so that you can benefit from that experience without maybe coming forward.
Yeah, yeah, groups can be super powerful. So if anybody's interested in checking out your services and learning more about you and the great work that you do in the fitness and health and exercise space, where can they find you?
So best place from a content perspective is Instagram. So my name is just my social media handle on Instagram. It's just at Jonny Landels. And then my website is nextstepnutrition.co.uk.
Okay, and I will link to those in the show notes.
Thank
So
you.
thank you again for being on the Joyful Nourishment podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Thanks for listening. The Joyful Nourishment podcast is produced with no financial backing, and your support means a lot to keep this project going. If this episode has been helpful in any way, please consider liking, subscribing, or leaving a 5-star review on whatever platform you listen to podcasts on. This helps the podcast to be found by others. And of course, you can also forward this episode to a friend whom you think may benefit. Find out more about what I offer on straightforwardnutrition.com, and if you're interested in working with me, please use the link in the show notes to book in for a free initial 30-minute session. And finally, please come and join the Joyful Nourishment community over on Substack, unless you're there already, by subscribing to my newsletter using the link below.